Before we begin, I just want to say that this commentary is not meant to attack all theists, it's only made to counter the arguments of the person I'm responding to. Although, that's going to be a tad hard in this case, because the person I'm responding to really doesn't say anything. The video I'm talking about is one by Redeemed Zoomer, which claims it proves God using math. And I'm just going to start by showing the video's conclusion, because I feel like that's really the best way to do it justice.
Like we said, math only exists in the mind, so its origin must also be a mind. Math contains infinite information, so this mind must be all-knowing. Math controls the universe, so this mind must also be all-powerful. And math is beyond and outside of our natural world, so this mind must be supernatural. And we have just described God.
So, these already have some issues, however, I'm going to get into the biggest one in a little bit, because Redeemed Zoomer does actually attempt to respond to the criticism I would levy against this claim. Instead, I'm going to zero in on the controls everything claim, because mathematics doesn't actually control things, it describes things. At one point in the video, this guy gives us some examples of things math explains, and he says the following.
But wait, math also explains things. Math can explain everything, from simple counting to the movement of planets. For anything you can think of, there's a bunch of math that explains what's going on, even down to the atomic level.
However, as he ends up admitting, math doesn't control these forces, it, to use his word in this clip, explains them. Planets don't orbit the way they do because math controls them, but because of forces in our universe like gravity. Even if you believe it was a deity that created these forces, that still wouldn't mean they're controlled by mathematics. That just doesn't make any sense. The rest of his points can be broken down in a similar manner, however the example I used is one where there was also a different issue, so that's why I focused on it. However, he does attempt to respond to this objection, so let's play that.
So, if math is only in our minds, but it also explains the natural world, then where does it come from? There's two possibilities, really. One is that math is just something we invented to explain what we observe in the natural world, and that would mean the origin of math is natural. But the other possibility is that math is already there because it controls the universe, and we've discovered it, and if that's true, then the origin of math is supernatural. Here's why the latter option is correct. Math contains infinite information. There's an infinite number of numbers, each with their own individual properties, and there's an infinite number of numbers in between any two numbers.
What do you mean by information exactly? It is true there are an infinite amount of numbers, however that does not disprove the idea that mathematics is how we express information we already have.
And we keep discovering things. Pi, which is the number that explains the area of a circle.
To be more specific, it's what you multiply the diameter of a circle by to get its circumference, and what you multiply the radius squared by in order to get its area.
Has an infinite number of digits that we keep discovering by doing calculations. If we were just making this stuff up, we could make pi be whatever we want it to be, but we can't do that because we know that that's not true.
Well, yeah, because then it would fail to accurately describe what we are using it to describe. If we turned pi into something else, then it is no longer serving its purpose. But that doesn't mean it isn't something we use to explain what we observe in the universe. If anything, it's our dedication to that which makes it both infinite and irrational. Because again, if we removed either of those properties, it would no longer be pi.
We know that all this information is out there somewhere, but it can't be in our physical universe because our universe is finite and math is infinite.
Again, what do you mean by information? You still haven't defined that at all. And by the way, your example of pi is something that is both present in the natural world, but is also infinite. But that also begs the question of what you mean by infinite, because pi isn't infinite in the sense that it is infinitely large, for example, but in that it's infinitely precise. It is of such specific value that it takes an infinite number of numbers to actually describe it. And I just want to point out that later in the video you say the universe doesn't have infinites.
It has infinite complexity, so it can't possibly be in our universe because the universe doesn't have infinites.
But why isn't the infinitely precise pi an example of an infinite? For that matter, what do you mean by complexity? And again, why doesn't pi work as an example of complexity? Yeah, if you haven't figured it out yet, this video is nothing more than jumping from ill-defined term to ill-defined term, and hoping that constitutes a coherent argument. It doesn't. Legitimately, the rest of the video is nothing more than waffling about how math is infinite, which I've already responded to, put together with discussion of the Mandelbrot set, which is more of the same, so I'm ending it here. Good night, and good luck. If you have not seen my original commentary on Redeemed Zoomer, I'm not going to act like it will be required to understand what I'm going to say in this commentary. However, I imagine it would be helpful. You see, previous commentary target, Redeemed Zoomer, recently released a video specifically listing out all of the arguments for God, one of which being the one I already covered. So let's see if he does a better job making it this time around.
Then there's the argument from mathematics, which says there's an infinite reality higher than our physical universe. So basic math isn't all that special. For example, the number 5 corresponds to 5 apples, and 5 times 3 corresponds to 3 groups of 5 apples. But the more you get into advanced math, the more math starts to get disconnected from our world, but it still works. For example, there's real numbers, which are numbers that correspond to real things. But there's also imaginary numbers that are just as mathematically real, but they don't correspond to the real world, which is why they're not called real numbers. But they still exist mathematically, even though they don't exist in the real world.
But imaginary numbers do exist in the real world. They actually play an incredibly important role in electrical engineering, for example. Also, while you're dismissing the existence of imaginary numbers in the real world, you don't do the same with negative numbers, even though those also don't really exist in the real world on their own. You can't have -1 apples, for example. You can be in debt, but you can't have a negative amount of money on you, I guess, unless you have the -$12 bill. You know, the one with Quentin Trimbley's face on it.
Just know that I'll always be right here on the -$12 bill.
Whoa. This is worthless.
It's less than worthless, my boy.
Let's look at the 5 most important numbers in mathematics. 1 is obviously important because it's the basis for all real numbers. 0 is very important because it's necessary for doing algebra. I is very important because it's the basis for all imaginary numbers. E is very important for doing exponential functions, and pi is necessary for doing math with circles. Now, all these numbers are seemingly unrelated to each other, but they fit together beautifully in this equation called Euler's identity. It was discovered by Euler, one of the greatest mathematicians in history, and he saw this as proof that math was designed by God. Also, Euler was a devout Calvinist.
I mean, that's a neat coincidence. However, you don't actually provide an argument for that meaning math is divinely inspired. You just say the person who came up with the equation said it was, which may very well be true, but it holds no relevance. Without presenting an actual argument, I can just say that I respectfully disagree, and you can't really say anything in response, now can you?
More evidence that math has a designer is the Mandelbrot set, which is generated by a very simple equation in the complex plane, but it produces infinite detail. You can keep zooming in on this shape, and it will keep generating more and more complexity, even though nobody designed this. The Mandelbrot set is infinite, and it's not found anywhere in our universe, so that means whatever created it must also be infinite and not from our universe.
But the Mandelbrot set was created by humans. You do show the Mandelbrot set equation, but that doesn't do anything on its own. If you write the equation on a piece of paper, nothing's going to happen. You have to plug numbers into the equation, calculate the results, and graph them accordingly for the Mandelbrot set to exist. I should also note, this isn't what the Mandelbrot set would look like once actually completed. We don't really know what it would look like because we simply can't access that information. I'm going to try to explain this, but I apologize if I get any terminology wrong. I am not a mathematician. Essentially, the black part of the set is stuff that when plugged back into the Mandelbrot set, never gets any bigger than 2. You see, an important part of this equation is plugging the results back into said equation a certain number of times. The more times you do this, the greater detail you will get in the image created. However, the only way to really properly do this is to plug the number back into the equation an infinite amount of times, which is impossible. We just can't do that. Anyway, final thoughts. The arguments in this video are completely unpersuasive once again. Good night, and good luck. Before we get into the commentary, I just want to begin with my normal disclaimer that this video is not me criticizing all theists or even all Christians. The only person I am criticizing in this commentary is the person I am covering. So, Redeemed Zoomer, I see you did another video attempting to prove that God is real because of numbers. And just like the last couple of times, I have some issues to say the least. Now, Redeemed Zoomer ends this video by saying this is more evidence the Bible is divinely inspired.
So these Bible coincidences are very interesting, and they help assure us that God was involved in the writing, assembling, and transmitting of the scriptures.
Never mind if they're coincidences like this image says, they shouldn't actually be proving anything one way or the other. Why are these coincidences too much for a human to have created? And for those curious, here are the coincidences in question.
In the Bible, all numbers have symbolic meaning, but the most important ones are 3 and 7. 3 represents God himself because it represents the Trinity, and 7 represents perfection and holiness. What's interesting is that we see both of these numbers encoded many different ways in the first verse of the Bible. Genesis 1:1 is, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," or in the original Hebrew, "Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz." Now the thing about the Hebrew alphabet is every letter is also a number. That's how the Hebrew people use numbers. They use letters. So you can add up the number values of every letter in a Hebrew word to get the number value for that word. And you can add up the number value for every word in a Hebrew sentence to get the number value of that sentence. So the number value for Genesis 1:1 is 2,701. Now, this number is 37 times 73, and these are both prime numbers, so that means there's no other way to factorize this number. Also, if you add 2701 to its mirror image, which is 1072, you get 3773. Also, the verse in Hebrew has 7 words, and 3 of those words are nouns, and if you add up the number values of those nouns, you get 777, which is 3 sevens. And it's also equal to 37 times 3 times 7. The one verb in the verse has 3 letters, and its number value is divisible by 7. The entire verse has 28 letters, and 28 is divisible by 7. All the nouns together have 14 letters, and 14 is divisible by 7.
Now, nothing Redeemed Zoomer said here is wrong, best as I can tell. However, that doesn't make what he did impressive. Because this is something that anybody could do, about essentially anything. And I know that because I've seen people do it. Fans of Cute Fuzzy Weasel will recognize names like Dave Johnson and Spirit Science, both of whom attempted to use mathematics and numerology, not entirely, I should note, but that was still a non-insignificant piece of their rhetoric, to argue that the Civil War didn't happen and that the moon was hollow, respectively. These aren't amazing patterns, they're somewhat unlikely coincidences. At most. You can even find people noticing mathematical patterns in other holy books. Fuck, in just a couple of seconds of Googling, I found somebody doing the same thing with the Quran. But I assume Redeemed Zoomer wouldn't suddenly convert to Islam because of this, would he? Anyway, he starts getting actually genuinely misleading when he talks about things like Bible chapters.
There's also a lot of coincidences with the chapters of the Bible. There's 1,189 of them, at least in Protestant Bibles.
Meaning this doesn't apply to over half of the Christian population. Really weird God would do that, honestly.
Psalm 117 is the middle chapter of the Bible, and it also happens to be the shortest chapter of the Bible, out of all 1189 chapters. The number of chapters in the Bible, plus its mirror image, is 11,000, a nice round number. 11,000 also happens to be the sum of 37 squared and its mirror image.
Okay, first off, it being a nice round number is not even remotely impressive. The odds of that occurring are 1 in 10. The 37 squared and its mirrored image thing is kinda cool though, I will grant him that. However, he's using an aspect of the Bible that was not created until over a millennia after it was finished in order to argue for its legitimacy. And I am not hyperbolizing with that statement, by the way. Given our modern use of chapter breaks in the Bible only goes back to around the 13th century.
Now let's talk about the Isaiah Bible coincidences. Isaiah is a book of the Bible with 66 chapters, and the Bible, at least the Protestant Bible, has 66 books. Isaiah is generally broken up into chapters 1 to 39 and chapters 40 to 66, with the first chapters focusing on judgment and the last chapters focusing on hope, just like the Bible is broken up into books 1 to 39, called the Old Testament, and books 40 to 66, called the New Testament, with the Old Testament focusing on the law and the New Testament focusing on the gospel. And there are many more parallels between the chapters of Isaiah and the books of the Bible. The first chapter of Isaiah says, "Hear me, you heavens, listen, earth, for the Lord has spoken." And the first book of the Bible begins with the Lord speaking the heavens and the earth into existence.
The verse you put on screen shows this to be false. It simply says God created the universe, not that he spoke it into existence.
And it's worth noting that Isaiah isn't just any book of the Bible, it has the most explicit prediction of Jesus in the entire Old Testament.
Those verses were in reference to Israel, not Jesus. Anyway, final thoughts. Although this is the least bad out of the videos from Redeemed Zoomer that I've covered so far, it still does not make a compelling argument, and it bounces back and forth between just citing coincidences and getting things wrong. Good night, and good luck.